Hello! We are on volume 3. Today we're reading Rawhead Rex. Of all the conquering armies that had tramped the streets of Zeal down the centuries, it was finally the mild tread of Sunday Tripper that brought the village to its knees. It had suffered Roman legions and the Norman conquest. It had survived the agonies of civil war, all without losing its identity to the occupying forces. But after centuries of boot and blade, it was to be the tourist, the new barbarians, that bested Zeal, their weapons courtesy and hard cash. It was ideally suited for the invasion. 40 miles southeast of London, amongst the orchards and the hop fields of the Kentish Weald, it was far enough from the city to make a trip an adventure, yet close enough to beat a quick retreat if the weather turned foul. Every weekend between May and October, Zeal was a watering hole for parched Londoners. They would swarm through the village on each Saturday, that promised sun, bringing their dogs, their plastic balls, their litters of children, and their children's litter, disgorging them in bawling hordes onto the village green, then returning to the tall man to compare traffic stories over glasses of warm beer. For their part, the zealots weren't unduly distressed by the Sunday trippers. At least they didn't spill blood. But their very lack of aggression made the invasion all the more insidious. Gradually, these city-weary people began to work a gentle but permanent change on the village. Many of them set their hearts on a home in the country. They were charmed by stone cottages set amongst churning oaks. They were enchanted by doves in the churchyard yews. Even the air, they'd say as they inhaled deeply, even the air smells fresher here. It smells of England. At first a few, then many, began to make bids for the empty barns and deserted houses that littered Zeal and its outskirts. They could be seen every fine weekend standing in the nettles and rubble, planning how to have a kitchen extension built and where to install the jacuzzi. And although many of them, once back in the comfort of Kilburn or St. John's Wood, chose to stay there, every year one or two of them would strike a reasonable bargain with one of the villagers and buy themselves an acre of the good life. So, as the years passed and the natives of Zeal were picked off by old age, the civil savages took over in their stead. The occupation was subtle, but the change was plain to the knowing eye. It was there in the newspapers the post office began to stock. What native of Zeal had ever purchased a copy of Harper's and Queen magazine, or leafed through the Times Literary Supplement? It was there, that change, and the bright new cars that clogged the one narrow street, laughingly called the high road. That was Zeal's backbone. It was there, too, in the buzz of gossip at the Tall Man, a sure sign the affairs of foreigners had become fit subject for debate and mockery. Indeed, as time went by, the invaders found a yet more permanent place in the heart of Zeal, as the perennial demons of their hectic lives, cancer and heart disease, took their toll, following their victims even into this new-found land. Like the Romans before them, like the Normans, like all invaders, the commuters made their profoundest mark upon this usurped turf, not by building on it, but by being buried underneath it. It was clammy, the middle of that September, Zeal's last September. Thomas Garrow, the only son of the late Thomas Garrow, was sweating up a healthy thirst as he dug in the corner of the 3-acre field. There had been a violent rainstorm the previous day, Thursday, and the earth was sodden. Clearing the ground for sowing next year wouldn't be the easy job Thomas thought it would be, but he'd sworn blind he'd have the field finished by the end of the week. It was heavy labor, clearing stones and sorting out the detritus of out-of-date machinery his father, lazy bastard, had left to rust where it lay. Must have been some good years, Thomas thought, some pretty fine damn years that his father could afford to let good machinery waste away. Come to think of it, that he could have afforded to leave the best part of 3 acres unplowed. Good healthy soil, too. This was the Garden of England, after all, land and money. Leaving 3 acres fallow was a luxury nobody could afford in these straitened times. But Jesus, it was hard work. The kind of work his father had put him to in his youth and he'd hated with a vengeance ever since. Still, it had to be done. And the day had begun well. The tractor was healthier after its overhaul, and the morning sky was rife with gulls across from the coast for a meal of freshly turned worms. They'd kept him raucous company as he worked, their insolent and their short tempers always entertaining. But then, when he came back to the field after a liquid lunch in the Tall Man, things began to go wrong. The engine started to cut out, for one, the same problem that he'd just spent £200 having seen to, and then, when he'd only been back at work a few minutes, he'd found the stone. It was an unspectacular lump of stuff poking out of the soil, perhaps a foot, its visible diameter a few inches short of a yard, its surface smooth and bare. No lichen even, just a few grooves in its face that might have once been words. A love letter perhaps, a Kilroy was here more likely, a date and a name likeliest of all. Whatever it had once been, monument or milestone, it was in the way now. He'd have to dig it up, or next year he'd lose a good 3 yards of plowable land. There was no way a plow could skirt around a boulder that size. Thomas was surprised about that the damn thing had been left in the field for so long without anyone bothering to remove it. But then, it was a long spell since the 3-acre field had been planted, certainly not in his 36 years. And maybe, now he came to think of it, not in his father's lifetime either. For some reason, if he'd ever known the reason, he'd forgotten it. This stretch of Garrow land had been left fallow for a good many seasons, maybe even for generations. In fact, there was a suspicion tickling the back of his skull that someone, probably his father, had said no crop would ever grow in that particular spot. But that was plain nonsense. If anything, plant life, albeit nettles and convolvulus, grew thicker and ranker in this forsaken 3 acres than in any plot in the district. So there was no reason on earth why hops shouldn't flourish here. Maybe even an orchard, though that took more patience and love than Thomas suspected he possessed. Whatever he chose to plant, it would surely spring up from such rich ground with rare enthusiasm, and he'd have reclaimed 3 acres of good land to bolster his shaky finances. If he could just dig out that bloody stone, he'd half thought of hiring in one of the earth movers from the building site at the north end of the village, just to haul itself across here and get its mechanical jaws working on the problem. Have the stone out and away in 2 seconds flat. But his pride resisted the idea of running for help at the first sign of a blister. The job was too small anyhow. He'd dig it out himself, the way his father would have done. That's what he decided. Now 2.5 hours later, he was regretting his haste. The ripening warmth of the afternoon had soured in that time, without much of a breeze to stir it around, had become stifling. Over from the downs came a stuttering roll of thunder, and Thomas could feel the static crawling at the nape of his neck, making the short hairs there stand up. The sky above the field was empty now. The gulls, too fickle to hang around once the fun was over, had taken some salt-smelling thermal. Even the earth, that had given up a sweet, sharp flavor as the blades turned on it that morning, now smelt joyless, and as he dug the black soil out from around the stone, his mind returned helplessly to the putrefaction that made it so very rich. His thoughts circled vacuously on the countless little deaths in every spadeful of soil he dug. This wasn't the way he was used to thinking, and the morbidity of it distressed him. He stopped for a moment, leaning on his spade, and regretting the 4th pint of Guinness he'd downed at lunch. Jesus Christ. I don't think I've ever seen anyone finish 4 pints of Guinness. I was a bartender for many years. And most people, they could just do like, maybe 2. I think I've seen maybe 2, 3. Anyway, 4. Sorry. That was normally a harmless enough ration, but today it swirled around in his belly. He could hear it, as dark as the soil in his spade, working up a scum of stomach acid and half-digested food. Think of something else, he told himself, or you'll get to puking. To take his mind off his belly, he looked at the field. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just a rough square of land bounded by an untrimmed hawthorn hedge. 1 or 2 dead animals lying in the shadow of the hawthorn, a starling, something else, too far gone to be recognizable. There was a sense of absence, but that wasn't so unusual. It would soon be autumn, and the summer had been too long, too hot for comfort. Looking up higher than the hedge, he watched the Mongol-headed cloud discharge a flicker of lightning to the hills. What had been the brightness of the afternoon was now pressed into a thin blue line at the horizon. Rain soon, he thought, and the thought was welcome. Cool rain, perhaps a downpour like the previous day. Maybe this time it would clear the air good and proper. Thomas stared back down at the unyielding stone and struck it with his spade. A tiny arc of white flame flew off. He cursed loudly and inventively, the stone, himself, the field. The stone just sat there in the moat he'd dug around it, defying him. He'd almost run out of options. The earth around the thing had been dug out 2 feet down. He hammered stakes under it, chained it, and then got the tractor going to haul it out. No joy. Obviously, he'd have to dig the moat deeper, drive the stakes further down. He wasn't going to let the damn thing beat him. Grunting his determination, he set to digging again. A fleck of rain hit the back of his hand, but he scarcely noticed it. He knew by experience that labor like this took singularity of purpose. Head down, ignore all distractions. He made his mind blank. There was just the earth, the spade, the stone, and his body. Push down, scoop up. Push down, scoop up. A hypnotic rhythm of effort. The trance was so total he wasn't sure how long he worked before the stone began to shift. The movement woke him. He stood upright. his vertebrae clicking, not quite certain that the shift was anything more than a twitch in his eye. Putting his heel against the stone, he pushed. Yes, it rocked in its grave. He was too drained to smile, but he felt victory close. He had the bugger. The rain was starting to come now, on heavier now, and it felt fine on his face. He drove a couple more stakes in around the stone and unseated a little further. He was going to get the better of the thing. You'll see, he said, you'll see. The third stake went deeper than the first two, and it seemed to puncture a bubble of gas underneath the stone, a yellowish cloud smelling so foul he stepped away from the hole to snatch a breath of pure air. There was none to be had. All he could do was hawk up a wad of phlegm to clear his throat and lungs. Whatever was under the stone, and there was something animal in the stench, it was very rotten. He forced himself back down to work, taking gasps of air into his mouth, not through his nostrils. His head felt tight, as though his brain was swelling and straining against the dome of his skull, pushing to be let out. Fuck you, he said, and beat another stake under the stone. His back felt as though it was about to break. On his right hand a blister had burst. A clag sat on his arm and feasted itself unswatted. Do it. Do it. Do it. He beat the last stake in without knowing he was doing it. And then the stone began to roll. He wasn't even touching it. The stone was being pushed out of its seating from beneath. He reached for his spade, which was still wedged beneath the stone. He suddenly felt possessive of it. It was his, a part of him, and he didn't want it near the hole. Not now. Not with the stone rocking like it had a geyser under it about to blow. Not with the air yellow and his brain swelling up like a marrow in August. He pulled hard on his spade. It wouldn't come. He cursed it and took two hands to the job, keeping at arm's length from the hole as he hauled, this increasing motion of the stone slinging up showers of soil, lice, and pebbles. He heaved at the spade again, but it wouldn't give. He didn't stop to analyze the situation. The work had sickened him. All he wanted was to get his spade, out of the hole and get the hell out of there. The stone bucked, but still he wouldn't let go of the spade. It had become fixed in his head that he had to have it before he could leave. Only when it was back in his hands, safe and sound, would he obey his bowels and run. Beneath his feet the ground began to erupt. The stone rolled away from the tomb as if feather light. A second cloud of gas, more obnoxious than the first, seemed to blow it on its way. At the same time, the spade came out of the hole, and Thomas saw what had hold of it. Suddenly, there was no sense in heaven or earth. There was a hand, a living hand, clutching the spade, a hand so wide it could grasp the blade with ease. Thomas knew the moment well. The splitting earth, the hand, the stench. He knew it from some nightmare he'd heard at his father's knee. Now he wanted to let go of the spade, but he no longer had the will. All he could do was obey some imperative from underground to haul its ligaments tore and from his sinews bleed. Beneath the thin crust of earth, Rawhead smelt the sky. It was pure ether to his dull senses, making him sick with pleasure. Kingdoms for the taking, just a few inches away. After so many years, after the endless suffocation, there was light on his eyes again and the taste of human terror on his tongue. His head was breaking surface now, his black hair wreathed with worms, his scalp seething with tiny red spiders. They'd irritated him 100 years, those spiders burrowing into his marrow, and he longed to crush them out. Pull, pull, he willed the human, and Thomas Garrow pulled until his pitiful body had no strength left, and inch by inch Rawhead was hoisted out of his grave in a shroud of prayers. The stone that had pressed on him for so long had been removed, and he was dragging himself up easily now, sloughing off the grave earth like a snake's skin. His torso was free. Shoulders twice as broad as a man's, lean, scarred arms stronger than any human. His limbs were pumping with blood, like a butterfly's wings, juicing with resurrection. His long, lethal fingers rhythmically clawed the ground as they gained strength. Thomas Garrow just stood and watched. There was nothing in him but awe. Fear was for those who still had a chance of life. He had none. Rawhead was out of his grave completely. He began to stand upright for the first in centuries. Clods of damp soil fell from his torso as he stretched to his full height, a yard above Garrow's 6 feet. Thomas Garrow stood in Rawhead's shadow, with his eyes still fixed on the gaping hole the king had risen from. In his right hand he still clutched his spade. Rawhead picked him up by the hair. His scalp tore under the weight of his body, so Rawhead seized Garrow round the neck, his vast hand easily enclosing it. Blood ran down Garrow's face from his scalp, and the sensation stirred him. Death was imminent, and he knew it. He looked down at his legs, thrashing uselessly below him. Then he looked up and stared directly into Rawhead's pitiless face. It was huge like the harvest moon, huge and amber. But this moon had eyes that burned in its pallid, pitted face. They were for all the world like wounds. those eyes as though somebody had gouged them in the flesh of Rawhead's face that set 2 candles to flicker in the holes. Garrow was entranced by the vastness of this moon. He looked from eye to eye, and then to the wet slits that were its nose, and finally, in a childish terror, down to the mouth. God, that mouth! It was so wide, so cavernous, it seemed to split the head in 2 as it opened. That was Thomas Garrow's last thought, that the moon was splitting in 2 and falling out of the sky on top of him. Then the king inverted the body, as he always had been his way with dead enemies, and drove Thomas head first into the hold, winding him down into the very grave his forefathers had intended to bury Rawhead in forever. By the time the thunderstorm proper broke out over Zeal, the king was a mile away from the 3-acre field, sheltering in the Nicholson barn. In the village, everyone went about their business, rain or no rain. Ignorance was bliss. There was no Cassandra amongst them, nor had Your Future in the Stars in that week's Gazette even hinted at the sudden deaths to come to a Gemini, 3 Leos, a Sagittarian, and a minor star system to others in the next few days. The rain had come down with the thunder, fat, cool spots of it, which rapidly turned into a downpour of monsoonal ferocity. Only when the gutters became torrents did people begin to take shelter. On the building site, the earth mover that had been roughly landscaping Ronnie Milton's back garden sat idling in the rain, receiving a second washdown in 2 days. The driver had taken the downpour as a signal to retire into the hut to talk racehorses and women. In the doorway of the post office, 3 of the villagers watched the drains backing up and tutted that there was always happen when it rained, and in half an hour there'd be a pool of water in the dip at the bottom of the high street, so deep you could sail a boat in it. And down in the dip itself, in the vestry of St. Peter's, Declan Ewan, the verger, watched the rain pelting down the hill in eager rivulets and gathering into a little sea outside the vestry gate. Soon be deep enough to drown in, he thought, and then, puzzled by why he imagined drowning, he turned away from the window and went back to the business of folding vestments. A strange excitement was in him today, and he didn't want to suppress it. It was nothing to do with the thunderstorm, though he'd always loved them since he was a child. No, there was something else stirring him up, and he was damned if he knew what. It was like being a child again, even if it was Christmas, and any minute Santa, the first Lord he'd ever believed in, would be at the door. The very idea made him want to laugh out loud, but the vestry was too sober a place for laughter, and he stopped himself, letting the smile curl inside him, a secret hope. While everyone else took refuge from the rain, Gwen Nicholson was getting thoroughly drenched. She was still in the yard behind the house, coaxing Amelia's pony towards the barn. The thunder had made the stupid beast jittery, and it didn't want to budge. Now Gwen was soaked and angry. "Will you come on, you brute?" she yelled at it over the noise of the storm. The rain lashed the yard and pummeled on top of her head. Her hair was flattened. "Come on! Come on!" The pony refused to budge. Its eyes showed crescents of white in its fear, and the more the thunder rolled and crackled around the yard, the less it wanted to move. Angrily, Gwen slapped it across the backside harder than she strictly needed to. It took a couple of steps in response to the blow, dropping steaming turds as it went, and Gwen took the advantage. Once she had it moving, she could drag it the rest of the way. "Warm barn," she promised it. "Come on, it's wet out here. You don't want to stay out here." The barn door was slightly ajar. Surely it must look like an inviting prospect, she thought, even to a pea-brained pony. She dragged it to within spitting distance of the barn, and one more slap got it through the door. As she'd promised the damn thing, the interior of the barn was sweet and dry, though the air smelt metallic with the storm. Gwen tied the pony to the crossbar in its stall and roughly threw a blanket over its glistening hide. She was damned if she was going to swab the creature down. That was Amelia's job. That was the bargain she'd made with her daughter when they'd agreed to buy the pony, that all the grooming and clearing out would be Amelia's responsibility, and to be fair to her, she'd done what she'd promised, more or less. The pony was still panicking. It stamped and rolled its eyes like a bad tragedian. There were flecks of foam on its lips. A little apologetically, Gwen patted its flank. She'd lost her temper. Time of the month. Now she regretted it. She only hoped Amelia hadn't been at her bedroom window watching. A gust of wind caught the barn door, and it swung closed. The sound of rain in the yard outside was abruptly muted. It was suddenly dark. The pony stopped stamping. Gwen stopped stroking its side. Everything stopped. Her heart, too, it seemed. Behind her, a figure that was almost twice her size rose from beyond the bales of hay. Gwen didn't see the giant, but her innards churned. Damn periods, she thought, rubbing her lower belly in a slow circle. She was normally as regular as clockwork, but this month she'd come a day early. She should go back to the house, get changed, get clean. Rawhead stood and looked at the nape of Gwen Nicholson's neck, where a single nip could easily kill. But there was no way he could bring himself to touch this woman, not today. She had the blood cycle on her. He could taste its tang, and it sickened him. It was taboo, that blood, and he had never taken a woman poisoned by its presence. Feeling the damp between her legs, Gwen hurried out of the barn without looking behind her and ran through the downpour back to the house, leaving the fretting pony in the darkness of the barn. Rawhead heard the woman's feet recede, heard the house door slam. He waited, to be sure she wouldn't come back. Then he padded across to the animal, reached down, and took hold of it. The pony kicked and complained, but Rawhead had in his time taken animals far bigger and far better armed than this. He opened his mouth. The gums were suffused with blood as the teeth emerged from them like claws unsheathed from a cat's paw. There were 2 rows on each jaw, 24 needle-sharp points. They gleamed as they closed around the meat of the pony's neck. Thick, fresh blood poured down Rawhead's throat. He gulped it greedily. The hot taste of the world. It made him feel strong and wise. This was only the first of many meals he would take. He'd gorge on anything that took his fancy, and nobody would stop him, not this time. And when he was ready, he'd throw those pretenders off his throne. He'd cremate them in their houses. He'd slaughter their children and wear their infants' bowels as necklaces. This place was his. Just because they tamed the wilderness for a while didn't mean they owned the earth. It was his, and nobody would take it from him, not even the holiness. He was wise to that, too. They'd never subdue him again. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the barn, the gray-pink intestines of the pony coiled around him, planning his tactics as best he could. He'd never been a great thinker. Too much appetite. It overwhelmed his reason. He lived in the eternal present of his hunger and his strength, feeling only the crude territorial instinct that would sooner or later blossom into carnage. The rain didn't let up for over an hour. Ron Melton was becoming impatient, a flaw in his nature that had given him an ulcer and a top-flight job in design consultancy. What Melton could get done for you couldn't be done quicker. He was the best, and he hated sloth in other people as much as in himself. Take his damned house, for instance. They'd promised it would be finished by mid-July, garden landscape, driveway laid, everything. And here he was, 2 months after that date, looking at a house that was still far from habitable. Half the windows without glass, the front door missing, the garden in a salt course, the driveway a mire. This was to be his castle, his retreat from a world that made him dyspeptic and rich, haven away from the hassles of the city where Maggie could grow roses and the children could breathe clean air. Except that it wasn't ready. Damn it. At his rate, he wouldn't be in until next spring, another winter in London. The thought made his heart sink. Maggie joined him, sheltering him under her red umbrella. Where are the kids? He asked. She grimaced. Back at the hotel, driving Mrs. Blatter crazy. Enid Blatter had borne their cavortings for 6 weekends through the summer. She'd had kids of her own, and she handled Debbie and Ian with aplomb. But there was limit, and even to her fund of mirth and merriment. We'd better get back to town. No, please, let's stay another day or 2. We can go back on Sunday evening. I want us all to go to the Harvest Festival service on Sunday. Now it was Ron's turn to grimace. Oh, hell. It's all a part of village life, Ronnie. If we're going to live here, we have to become a part of the community. He whined like a little boy when he was in this kind of mood. She knew him so well she could hear his next words before he said them. I don't want to. Well, we've no choice. We can go back tonight. Ronnie, there's nothing we can do here. The kids are bored. You're miserable. Maggie had set her features in concrete. She wasn't going to budge an inch. He knew that face as well as she knew his whining. He studied the puddles that were forming in what might one day be their front garden, unable to imagine grass there, roses there. It all suddenly seemed impossible. You go back to town if you like, Ronnie. Take the kids. I'll stay here, train at home Sunday night. Clever, he thought, to give him a get-out that's more unattractive than staying put. 2 days in town looking after the kids alone? No, thank you. Okay, you win. We'll go to the Harvest Bloody Festival. Martyr. As long as I don't have to pray. Amelia Nicholson ran into the kitchen, her round face white, and collapsed in front of her mother. There was greasy vomit on her green plastic mackintosh and blood on her green plastic Wellingtons. Gwen yelled for Denny. Their little girl was shivering in her faint, her mouth chewing a word or words that couldn't come. What is it? Denny was thundering down the stairs. For Christ's sake! Amelia was vomiting again. Her face was practically blue. What's wrong with her? She just came in. You'd better ring for an ambulance. Denny put his hand on her cheek. She's in shock. Ambulance, Denny! Gwen was taking off the green mackintosh and loosened the child's blouse. Slowly, Denny stood up. Through the rain-laced window, he could see into the yard. The barn door flapped open and closed in the wind. Somebody was inside. He glimpsed movement. For Christ's sake, ambulance! Gwen said again. Denny wasn't listening. There was somebody in his barn, on his property, and he had a strict ritual for trespassers. The barn door opening again, teasing. Yes, retreating into the dark, interloper. He picked up the rifle beside the door, keeping his eyes on the yard as much as he could. Behind him, Gwen had left Amelia on the kitchen floor and was dialing for help. The girl was moaning now. She was going to be okay. Just some filthy trespasser scaring her, that's all, on his land. He opened the door and stepped into the yard. He was in his shirt sleeves and the wind was bitingly cold, but the rain had stopped. Underfoot the ground glistened and drips fell from every eave and portico, a fidgety percussion that accompanied him across the yard. The barn door swung listlessly ajar again, and this time stayed open. He could see nothing inside. Half wondered if a trick of the light had. But no, he'd seen someone moving in here. The barn wasn't empty. Something, not the pony, was watching him even now. They'd see the rifle in his hands and they'd sweat. Let them. Come into his place like that. Let them think he was going to blow their balls off. He covered the distance in a half a dozen confident strides and stepped into the barn. The pony's stomach was beneath his shoe, one of its legs to the right, the upper shank gnawed to the bone. Pools of thickening blood reflected the holes in the roof. The mutilation made him want to heave. All right, he challenged the shadows. Come out. He raised his rifle. You hear me, you bastard? Out, I said, or I'll blow you to kingdom come. He meant it, too. At the far end of the barn, something stirred amongst the bales. Now I've got the son of a bitch, thought Denny. The trespasser got up, all 9 feet of him, and stared at Denny. Jesus. And without warning, it was coming at him, coming like a locomotive, smooth and efficient. He fired into it, and the bullet struck its upper chest, but the wound hardly slowed it. Nicholson turned and ran. The stones of the yard were slippery beneath his shoes, and he had no turn of speed to outrun it. It was at his back in 2 beats, and on him in another. Gwen dropped the phone when she heard the shot. She raced to the window in time to see her sweet Denny eclipsed by a gargantuan form. It howled as it took him and threw him up in the air like a sack of feathers. She watched helplessly as his body twisted the apex of its journey before plummeting back down to earth again. It hit the yard with a thud she felt in her every bone, and the giant was at his body like a shot, treading his loving face to muck. She screamed, trying to silence herself with her hand. Too late. The sound was out, and the giant was looking at her, staring at her, straight at her, its malice piercing the window. Oh God, it had seen her, and now was coming for her, loping across the yard, a naked engine, and grinning a promise at her as it came. Gwen snatched Amelia off the floor and hugged her close, pressing the girl's face against her neck. Maybe she wouldn't see. She mustn't see. The sound of its feet slapping on the wet yard got louder. Its shadow filled the kitchen. Jesus, help me. It was pressing at the window, its body so wide that it canceled out the light, its lewd, revolting face smeared on the watery pane. Then it was smashing through, ignoring the glass that bit into its flesh. It smelled child meat. It wanted child meat. It would have child meat. Its teeth were spilling into view, widening that smile into an obscene laugh. Ropes of saliva hung from its jaws. It clawed the air like a cat after a mouse in a cage, pressing further and further in, each swipe closer to the morsel. Gwen flung open the door into the hall as the thing lost patience with snatching and began to demolish the window frame and clamber through. She locked the door after her while crockery smashed and wood splintered on the other side. Then she began to load all the hall furniture against it. Tables, chairs, coat stand, knowing even as she did it that it would be matchwood in 2 seconds flat. Amelia was kneeling on the hall floor where Gwen had set her down. Her face was a thankful blank. All right, that was all she could do. Now upstairs. She picked up her daughter, who was suddenly air light, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Halfway up, the noise in the kitchen stopped utterly. She suddenly had a reality crisis. On the landing where she stood was all peace and calm. Dust gathered minutely on the windowsills, flowers wilted. All of the infinitesimal domestic procedures went on as though nothing had happened. Dreaming it, she had said. God, yes, dreaming it. She sat down on the bed Denny and she had slept in together for 8 years and tried to think straight. Some vile menstrual nightmare. That's what it was. Some rape fantasy out of control. She lay Amelia on the pink eater down. Denny hated pink, but suffered it for her sake, and stroked the girl's clammy forehead, dreaming it. Then the room darkened, and now she looked up, knowing what she'd see. It was there, the nightmare all over the upper windows, its spidery arms spanning the width of the glass, clinging like an acrobat to the frame, its repellent teeth sheathing and unsheathing as it gawked in her terror. In one swooping movement, she snatched Amelia up from the bed and dived towards the door. Behind her, glass shattered, and a gust of cold air swept into the bedroom. It was coming. She ran across the landing to the top of the stairs, but it was after her in a heartbeat. Yeah. Ducking through the bedroom door, its mouth a tunnel. It whooped as it reached to steal the mute parcel in her arms, huge in the confined space of the landing. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't outfight it. Its hands fixed on Amelia with insolent ease and tugged. The child screamed as it took her, her fingernails raking 4 furrows across her mother's face as she left her arms. Gwen stumbled back, dizzied by the unthinkable sight in front of her, and lost balance at the top of the stairs. As she fell backwards, she saw Amelia's tear-stained face, dull stiff, being fed between those rows of teeth. Then her head hit the banister and her neck broke. She bounced down the last 6 steps, a corpse. The rainwater had drained away a little by early evening, but the artificial lake at the bottom of the dip still flooded the road to a depth of several inches. Serenely, it reflected the sky, pretty but inconvenient. Reverend Coote quietly reminded Declan Ewan to report the blocked drains to the county council. It was the 3rd time of asking, and Declan blushed at the request. Sorry, All right, no problem, Declan, but we really must get them cleared. A vacant look, a beat, a thought. Autumn always clogs them again, of course. Coote made a roughly cyclical gesture, intending a sort of observation about how it really wouldn't make that much difference when or if the council cleared the drains. Then the thought disappeared. For there were more pressing issues. For one, the Sunday sermon. For a second, the reason why he couldn't make much sense of sermon writing this evening. There was an unease in the air today that made every reassuring word he'd committed to paper curdle as he wrote it. Coote went back to the window, back to Declan, and scratched his palms. They itched, maybe an attack of eczema again. Now he could only speak, find some words to shape his distress. Never in his 45 years had he felt so incapable of communication, and never in those years had it been so vital that he talk. Shall I go now? Declan asked. Coote shook his head. A moment longer, if you would. He turned to the verger. Declan Ewan was 29, though he had the face of a much older man. Bland, pale features, his hair receding prematurely. What will this egg face make of my revelation? Thought Coote. He'll probably laugh. That's why I can't find the words, because I don't want to. I'm afraid of looking stupid. Here I am, man of the cloth, dedicated to the Christian mysteries. For the first time in 40-odd years, I've had a real glimpse of something, a vision maybe, and I'm scared of being laughed at. Stupid man, Coote. Stupid, stupid man. He took off his glasses. Declan's empty features became a blur. Now at least he didn't have to look at the smirking. Declan, this morning I have what I can only describe as a visitation. Declan said nothing, nor did the blur move. I don't quite know how to say this. Our vocabulary's impoverished when it comes to these sorts of things. But frankly, I've never had such a direct, such an unequivocal manifestation of... Coote stopped. Did he mean God? God, he said, not sure that he did. Declan said nothing for a moment. Coote risked returning his glasses to their place. The egg hadn't cracked. Can you say what it was like? Declan asked, his equilibrium absolutely unspoiled. Coote shook his head. He'd been trying to find the words all day, but the phrases all seemed so predictable. What was it like? Declan insisted. Why didn't he understand there were no words? I must try, thought Coote. I must. I was at the altar after morning prayer, he began, and I felt something going through me, like electricity almost. It made my hair stand on end, literally on end. Coote's hand was running through his short-cropped hair as he remembered the sensation, the hair standing bolt upright like a field of gray ginger corn, and that buzzing at the temples, in his lungs, at his groin. It had actually given him a hard-on, not that he was going to be able to tell Declan that. But he'd stood there at the altar with an erection so powerful it was like discovering the joy of lust all over again. I won't claim, I can't claim it was our Lord God, though he wanted to believe that his God was the Lord of the Hard-On. I can't even claim it was Christian, but something today happened. I felt it. Declan's face was still impenetrable. Coot watched it for several seconds, impatient for its disdain. Well, he demanded. Well, what? Nothing to say? The egg frowned for a moment, a furrow in its shell. Then it said, God help us, almost in a whisper. What? I felt it too, not quite as you described, not quite an electric shock, but something. Why God help us, Declan? Are you afraid of something? He made no reply. If you know something about these experiences that I don't, please tell me. I want to know, to understand. God, I have to understand. Declan pursed his lips. Well, his eyes became more indecipherable than ever, and for the first time Coot caught a glimpse of a ghost behind Declan's eyes. Was it despair, perhaps? There's a lot of history to this place, he said. A history of things on this site. Coot knew Declan had been delving into Zeal's history, harmless enough pastime. The past was the past. There's been a settlement here for centuries, stretches back well before Roman occupation. No one knows how long. There's probably always been a temple on this site. Nothing odd about that. Coot offered up a smile, inviting Declan to reassure him. A part of him wanted to be told everything was well with this world, even if it was a lie. Declan's face darkened. He had no reassurance to give. And there was a forest here, huge, the wild woods. Was it still despair behind the eyes, or was it nostalgia? Not some tame little orchard. A forest you could lose a full city in, full of beasts. Wolves, you mean? Bears? Declan shook his head. There were things that owned this land, before Christ, before civilization. Most of them didn't survive the destruction of their natural habitat. Too primitive, I suppose. But strong. Not like us. Not human. Something else altogether. So what? One of them survived as late as the 1400s. There's a carving of it being buried. It's on the altar. On the altar? Underneath the cloth. I found it a while ago. Never thought much of it. Till today. Today I tried to touch it. He produced his fist and unclenched it. The flesh of his palm was blistered. Pus ran from the broken skin. It doesn't hurt, he said. In fact, it's quite numb. Serves me right, really. I should have known. Coot's first thought was that the man was lying. His second was that there's some logical explanation. His third was his father's dictum. Logic is the last refuge of a coward. Declan was speaking again. This time he was seeping with excitement. They called it Rawhead. What? The beast they buried. It's in the history books. Rawhead it was called because its head was huge and the color of the moon and raw like meat. Declan couldn't stop himself now. He was beginning to smile. It ate children, he said, and he beamed like a baby about to receive its mother's tit. It wasn't until early on the Saturday morning that the atrocity at the Nicholson farm was discovered. Mick Glossop had been driving up to London, and he'd taken the road that ran beside the farm. Don't know why, don't usually, funny really. And Nicholson's Frisian herd was kicking up a row at the gate, their udders distended. They'd clearly not been milked in 24 hours. Glossop had stopped his jeep on the road and gone into the yard. The body of Denny Nicholson was already crawling with flies, though the sun had barely been up an hour. Inside the house, the only remains of Amelia Nicholson were shreds of dress and a casually discarded foot. Gwen Nicholson's unmutilated body lay at the bottom of the stairs. There was no sign of a wound or any sexual interference with the corpse. By 9:30, Zeal was swarming with police, and the shock of the incident registered on every face in the street. Though there were conflicting reports as to the state of the bodies, there was no doubt on the brutality of the murders, especially the child, dismembered presumably, her body taken away by the killer for God knows what purpose. The murder squad set up a unit at the Tall Man, while house-to-house interviews were conducted throughout the village. Nothing came immediately to light. No strangers seen in the locality, no more suspicious behavior from anyone than was normal for a poacher or a bent-building merchant. It was Enid Blatter, one of the ample bust, and the motherly manner, who mentioned that she hadn't seen Thorn Garrow for over 24 hours. They found him where his killer had left him, the worse for a few hours of picking. Worms at his head and gulls at his legs, the flesh of his shins where his trousers had slid out of his boots was pecked to the bone. When he was dug up, families of refugee lice scurried from his ears. The atmosphere in the hotel that night was subdued. In that bar, Detective Sergeant Gissing went down from London to head the investigation, had found a willing ear in Ron Milton. He was glad to be conversing with a fellow Londoner, and Milton kept them both in scotch and water for the best part of 3 hours. 20 years in the force, Gissing kept repeating, and I've never seen anything like it. Which wasn't strictly true. There'd been that whore, or selected highlights thereof, he'd found in a suitcase at Euston's left luggage department a good decade ago, and the addict who'd taken it upon himself to hypnotize a polar bear at London Zoo. He'd been a sight for sore eyes when they dredged him out of the pool. He'd seen a good deal, had Stanley Gissing. But this... Never seen anything like it, he insisted. Fair made me want to puke. Ron wasn't quite sure why he listened to Gissing. It was just something to while the night away. Ron, who'd been a radical in his younger days, had never liked policemen much, and there was some quirky satisfaction to be had from getting his self-satisfied crap pissed out of his tiny skull. He's a fucking lunatic, Gissing said. You can take my word for it. We'll have him easy. A man like that isn't in control, you see. Doesn't bother to cover his tracks. Doesn't even care if he lives or dies. God knows any man who can tear a 7-year-old girl to shreds like that. He's on the verge of going bang. Seen him. Yes? Oh, yes, seen him weep like children. Blood all over like it was just out of the abattoir, and tears on their faces. Pathetic. So you'll have him. Like that, said Gissing, and snapped his fingers. He got to his feet a little unsteady. Sure as God made little apples, we'll have him. He glanced at his watch and then at the empty glass. Ron made no further offers of refills. Well, said Gissing, must be getting back to town. Put in my report. He swayed to the door and left Milton to the bill. Rawhead watched Gissing's car crawl out of the village and along the north road, the headlights making very little impression on the night. The noise of the engine made Rawhead nervous, though, as it over-revved up the hill past the Nicholson farm. It roared and coughed like no beast he had encountered before, and somehow the Homo sapiens had control of it. If the kingdom was to be taken back from the usurpers, sooner or later he would have to best one of those beasts. Rawhead swallowed his fear and prepared for the confrontation. The moon grew teeth. In the back of the car, Stanley was near as darned asleep, dreaming of little girls. In his dreams, those charming nymphets were climbing a ladder on their way to bed, and he was on duty beside the ladder, watching them climb, catching glimpses of their slightly soiled knickers as they disappeared into the sky. It was a familiar dream, one that he would never have admitted to, not even drunk. Not that he was ashamed exactly. He knew for a fact many of his colleagues entertained peccadillos every beat as offbeat as, and some a good deal less savory than his. But he was possessive of it. It was his particular dream, and he wasn't about to share it with anyone. In the driving seat, the young officer, who had been chauffeuring Gissing around for the best part of 6 months, was waiting for the old man to fall well and truly asleep. Then and only then could he risk turning the radio on to catch up with the cricket scores. Australia were well down in the test. A late rally seemed unlikely. Ah, now there was a career, he thought as he drove, beats this routine into a cocked hat. Both lost in their reveries, driver and passenger, neither caught sight of Rawhead. He was stalking the car now, his giant stride easily keeping pace with it as it navigated the winding, unlit road. All at once his anger flared, and roaring, he left the field for the tarmac. The driver swerved to avoid the immense form that skipped into the burning headlights, its mouth issuing a howl like a pack of rabid dogs. The car skidded on the wet ground, its left wing grazing the bushes that ran along the side of the road, a tangle of branches lashing the windscreen as it careered on its way. On the back seat, Gissing fell off the ladder he was climbing, just as the car came to the end of its hedgerow tour and met an iron gate. Gissing was flung against the front seat, winded but uninjured. The impact took the driver over the wheel and through the window in 2 short seconds. His feet, now in Gissing's face, twitched. From the road, Rawhead watched the death of the metal box. Its tortured voice, the howl of its wretched flank, the shattering of its face frightened him, but it was dead. He waited for a few cautious moments before advancing up the road to sniff the crumpled body. There was an aromatic smell in the air, which pricked his sinuses, and the cause of it, the blood of the box, was dribbling out of its broken torso and running away down the road. Certain now that it must be finished, he approached. There was someone alive in the box. None of the sweet child flesh he savored so much, just tough male meat. It was a comical face that peered at him, round, wild eyes, its silly mouth open and closed like a fish's. He kicked the box to make it open, and when that didn't work, he wrenched off the doors. Then he reached and drew the whimpering male out of his refuge. Was this one of the species that had subdued him? this fearful mite with jelly lips. He laughed at its pleas, then turned Gissing on his head and held him upside down by one foot. He waited until the cries died down, then reached between the twitching legs and found the mite's manhood. Not large, quite shrunk, in fact, by fear. Gissing was blathering all kinds of stuff. None of it made any sense. The only sound Rawhead understood from the mouth of the man was this sound he was hearing now, this high-pitched shriek that always attended a gelding. Once finished, he dropped Gissing beside the car. A fire had begun in the smashed engine. He could smell it. He was not so much a beast that he feared fire. Respected it, yes, but not feared. Fire was a tool. He'd used it many times to burn out enemies, to cremate them in their beds. Now he stepped back from the car as the flame found the petrol and fire erupted into the air. Heat balled towards him and he smelt the hair in front of his body crisp, but he was too entranced by the spectacle not to look. The fire followed the blood of the beast, consuming Gissing and licking along the rivers of petrol like an eager dog after a trail of piss. Rawhead watched and learned a new and lethal lesson. In the chaos of his study, Coot was unsuccessfully fighting off sleep. He spent a good deal of the evening at the altar, some of it with Declan. Tonight there'd be no praying, just sketching. Now he had a copy of the altar carving in his desk in front of him, and he'd spent an hour just staring at it. The exercise had been fruitless. Either the carving was too ambiguous or his imagination lacked breath. Whichever, he could make very little sense of the image. It pictured a burial, certainly, but that was about all he was able to work out. Maybe the body was a little bigger than that of the mourners, but nothing exceptional. He thought of Zeal's pub, the tall man, and smiled. It might well have pleased some medieval wit to picture the burial of a brewer under the altar cloth. In the hall, a sick clock struck 12:15, which meant it was almost 1. Coot got up from his desk, stretched, and switched off the lamp. He was surprised by the brilliance of the moonlight streaming through the crack of the curtain. It was a full harvest moon, and the light, though cold, was luxuriant. He put the guard in front of the fire and stepped into the darkened hallway, closing the door behind him. The clock ticked loudly. Somewhere over towards Gouthurst, he'd heard the sound of an ambulance siren. What was happening, he wondered, and opened the front door to see what he could see. There were car headlights on the hill and a distant throb of blue police lights, more rhythmical than the ticking at his back. Accident on the north road, easy early for ice and surely not cold enough. He watched the lights set on the hill like jewels on the back of a whale, winking away. It was quite chilly, come to think of it. No weather to be standing in the... He frowned. Something caught his eye, of movement in the far corner of the churchyard underneath the trees. The moonlight etched the scene in monochrome, black yews, gray stones, a white chrysanthemum strewing its petals on a grave, and black in the shadow of the yews, but outlined clearly against the slab of a marble tomb beyond, a giant. Coot stepped out of the house in slippered feet. The giant was not alone. Somebody was kneeling in front of it, a smaller, more human shape, its face raised and clear in the light. It was Declan. Even from a distance, it was clear that he was smiling up at his master. Coot wanted to get closer, a better look at the nightmare. As he took his third step, his foot crunched on a piece of gravel. The giant seemed to shift in the shadows. Was it turning to look at him? Coot chewed on his heart. No, let it be deaf, please God. Let it not see me. Make me invisible. The prayer was apparently answered. The giant made no sign of having seen his approach. Taking courage, Coot advanced across the pavement of gravestones, dodging from tomb to tomb for cover, barely daring to breathe. He was in a few feet of the tableau now, and he could see the way, for the creature's head was bowed towards Declan. He could hear the sound like sandpaper on stone it was making at the back of his throat. But there was more to the scene. Declan's vestments were torn and dirtied, his thin chest bare. Moonlight caught his sternum, his ribs. His state and his position were unequivocal. This was adoration, pure and simple. The Coot heard the splashing. He stepped closer and saw the giant was directing a glistening rope of urine into Declan's upturned face. It splashed into his slackly opened mouth and ran over his torso. The gleam of joy didn't leave Declan's eyes for a moment as he received his baptism. Indeed, he turned his head from side to side in his eagerness to be totally defiled. The smell of the creature's discharge wafted across to Coot. It was acidic, vile. How could Declan bear to have a drop of it on him, much less bathe in it? Coot wanted to cry out, "Stop the depravity!" But even in the shadow of the yew, the shape of the beast was terrifying. It was too tall and too broad to be human. This was surely the beast of the wild woods Declan had been trying to describe. This was the child devourer. Had Declan guessed, when he eulogized about the monster, what power it would have over his imagination? Had he known all along that if the beast was to come sniffing for him, he'd kneel in front of it, call it Lord, before Christ, before civilization, he'd said? Let it discharge his bladder onto him and smile? Yes, so yes. And so let him have his moment. Don't risk your neck for him, Coot thought. He's where he wants to be. Very slowly he backed off towards the vestry, his eyes still fixed on the degradation in front of him. The baptism dribbled to a halt, but Declan's hands, cupped in front of him, still held a quantity of fluid. He put the heels of his hands to his mouth and drank. Coot gagged, unable to prevent himself. For an instant he closed his eyes to shut out the sight, and opened them again to see that the shadowy head had turned towards him and was looking at him with eyes that burned in the blackness. Christ Almighty. It saw him. For certain this time, it saw him. It roared, and its head changed shape with the shadow, its mouth opened so horribly wide. Sweet Jesus. Already it was charging towards him, antelope lithe, leaving its acolyte slumped beneath the tree. Coot turned and ran as if he hadn't in many a long year, hurdling the graves as he fled. It was just a few yards, the door, some kind of safety. Not for long, maybe, but time to think, to find a weapon. Run, you old bastard. Christ the race, Christ the prize. 4 yards, run. The door was open, almost there, a yard to go. He crossed the threshold and swung round to slam the door on his pursuer, but no! Rawhead had shot his hand through the door, a hand 3 times the size of a human hand. It was snatching at the empty air, trying to find Coot, the roars relentless. Coot threw his full weight against the oak door. The door stile, edged with iron, bit into Rawhead's forearm. The roar became a howl, venom and agony mingled with a din that was heard from one end of Zeal to the other. It stained the night up as far as the north road, where the remains of Gissing and its driver were being scraped up and parceled into plastic. It echoed round the icy walls of the Chapel of Rest, where Denny and Gwen Nicholson were already beginning to degenerate. It was heard, too, in the bedrooms of Zeal, where living couples lay side by side, maybe an arm numbed under the other's body, where the old lay awake, working out the geography of the ceiling, where children dreamt of the womb and babies mourned it. It was heard again and again as Rawhead raged at the door. The howl made Coot's head swim. His mouth babbled prayers, but the much-needed support from on high showed no sign of coming. He felt his strength ebbing away. The giant was already steadily gaining access, pressing the door open inch by inch by inch. Coot's feet slid on the too-well polished floor. His muscles were fluttering as they faltered. This was a contest he had no chance of winning, not if he tried to match his strength to that of the beast, sinew for sinew. If he was to see tomorrow morning, he needed some strategy. Coot pressed harder against the wood, his eyes darting around the hallway looking for a weapon. It mustn't get in. It mustn't have mastery over him. A bitter smell was in his nostrils. For a moment he saw himself naked and kneeling in front of the giant with its piss beating on his skull. Hard on the heels of that picture came another flurry of depravities. It was all he could do to not let the obscenities get a permanent hold. Its mind was working its way into his, a thick wedge of filth pressing its way through his memories, encouraging buried thoughts to the surface. Wouldn't it ask for worship just like any god? Wouldn't its demands be plain and real, not ambiguous like those of the Lord he'd served up until now? That was a fine thought, to give himself up to this certainty that beat on the other side of the door and lie open in front of it and let it ravage him. Rawhead. Its name was a pulse in his ear. Rawhead. In desperation, knowing his fragile mental defenses were within an ace of collapsing, his eyes alighted on the closed stand to the left of the door. Rawhead. Rawhead. And the name was an imperative. Rawhead. Rawhead. It evoked a skinhead, its defenses peeled back, a thing close to bursting, no telling if it was pain or pleasure, but easy to find out. It almost had possession of him. He knew it. It was now or never. He took one arm from the door and stretched towards the rack for a walking stick. There was one amongst them he wanted in particular. He called it his cross-country stick, 1.5 yards of stripped ash, well used and resilient. His fingers coaxed it towards him. Rawhead had taken advantage of the lack of force behind the door. Its leathery arm was working its way in, indifferent to the way the door jamb scored the skin. The hand, its finger strong as steel, had caught the folds of Coot's jacket. Coot raised the ash stick and brought it down on Rawhead's elbow, where the bone was vulnerably close to the surface. The weapon splintered on impact, but it did its job. On the other side of the door, the howl began again, and Rawhead's arm was rapidly withdrawn. As the fingers slid out, Coot slammed the door and bolted it. There was a short hiatus, seconds only, before the attack began again, this time a 2-fist beating on the door. The hinges began to buckle. The wood groaned. It would be a short time, a very short time, before it gained access. It was strong, and now it was furious, too. Coot crossed the hall and picked up the phone. Police, he said, and began to dial. How long before he put two and two together, gave up on the door, and moved up to the windows? They were leaded, but that wouldn't keep it out for long. He had minutes at the most, probably seconds, depending on his brain power. His mind, loose from Rawhead's grasp, was a chorus of fragmented prayers and demands. If I die, he found himself thinking, will I be rewarded in heaven for dying more brutally than any country vicar might reasonably expect? Is there compensation in paradise for being disemboweled in the front hall of your own vestry? There was only one officer left on duty at the police station. The rest were up on the North Road, clearing up after Gissing's party. The poor man could make very little sense of Reverend Coote's pleas, but there was no mistaking the sound of splintering wood that accompanied the babbles, nor the howling in the background. The officer put the phone down and radioed for help. The patrol on the North Road took 20, maybe 25 seconds to answer. In that time, Rawhead had smashed the central panel of the vestry door and was now demolishing the rest. Not that the patrol knew that. After the sights they'd faced up there, the chauffeur's charred body, Gissing's missing manhood, they'd become insolent with experience, like our old war veterans. It took the officer at the station a good minute to convince them of the urgency in Coote's voice. In that time, Rawhead had gained access. In the hotel, Ron Milton watched the parade of lights blinking on the hill, heard the sirens and Rawhead's howls, and was besieged by doubts. Was this really the country village he had intended to settle himself and his family in? He looked down at Maggie, who had been awoken by the noise, but was now asleep again, her bottle of sleeping tablets almost empty on the bedside cabinet. He felt, though, she would have laughed at him for it, protective towards her. He wanted to be her hero. She was the one who took the self-defense night classes, however, while he grew overweight on expense account lunches. It made him inexplicably sad to watch her sleep, knowing he had so little power over life and death. Rawhead stood in the hollow of the vestry in a confetti of shattered wood. His torso was pinpricked with splinters, and dozens of tiny wounds bled down his heavy in bulk. His sour sweat permeated the hall like incense. He sniffed the air for the man, but he was nowhere near. Rawhead bared his teeth in frustration, expelling a thin whistle of air from the back of his throat, and loped down the hall towards the study. There was warmth there. His nerves could feel it at 20 yards. There was comfort, too. He overturned the desk and shattered two of the chairs, partly to make more room for himself, mostly out of sheer destructiveness, then threw away the fire guard and sat down. Warmth surrounded him, healing, living warmth. He luxuriated in the sensation as it embraced his face, his lean belly, his limbs. He felt it heat his blood too, and so stir memories of other fires he had set in fields of burgeoning wheat. And he recalled another fire, the memory of which his mind tried to dodge and duck, but he couldn't avoid thinking about it. The humiliation of that night would be with him forever. They'd picked their season so carefully, high summer, and no rain in 2 months. The undergrowth of the wild woods was tinder dry. Even the living tree caught the flame easily. He had been flushed out of his fortress with streaming eyes, confused and fearful, to be met with spikes and nets on every side, and that thing they had, that sight that could subdue him. Of course, they weren't courageous enough to kill him. They were too superstitious for that. Besides, didn't they recognize his authority, even as they wounded him, their terror an homage to it? So they buried him alive, and that was worse than death. Wasn't that the very worst? Because he could live at ages, and never died, not even locked in the earth, just left to wait 100 years and suffer, and another 100 and another, while the generations walked on the ground above his head and lived and died and forgot him. Perhaps the women didn't forget him. He could smell them even through the earth when they came close to his grave, and though they might not have known it, they felt anxious. They persuaded their men to abandon the place altogether, so he was left absolutely alone, and not even a gleaner for company. Loneliness was their revenge on him, he thought, for the times he and his brothers had taken women into the woods, spread them out, spiked and loosed them again, bleeding but fertile. They would die having the children of those rapes. No woman's anatomy could survive the thrashing of a hybrid, its teeth, its anguish. That was the only revenge he and his brothers ever had on the big-bellied sex. Rawhead stroked himself and looked up at the gilded reproduction of The Light of the World that hung above Coote's mantelpiece. The image woke no tremors of fear or remorse in him. It was a picture of a sexless martyr, doe-eyed and woebegone. No challenge there. The true power, the only power that could defeat him, was apparently gone, lost beyond recall, its place usurped by a virgin shepherd. He ejaculated silently, his thin semen hissing onto the hearth. The world was his to rule unchallenged. He would have warmth and food in abundance. Babies even. Yes, baby meat. That was the best. Just dropped mites, still blind from the womb. He stretched, sighing in anticipation of that delicacy, his brain awash with atrocities. From his refuge in the crypt, Coot heard the police car squealing to a halt outside the vestry, then the sound of feet on the gravel path. He judged there to be at least half a dozen. It would be enough, surely. Cautiously, he moved through the darkness towards the stairs. Something touched him. He almost yelled, biting his tongue a moment before the cry escaped. "Don't go now," a voice said from behind him. It was Declan, and he was speaking altogether too loudly for comfort. The thing was above them, somewhere. It could hear them if he wasn't careful. Oh God, it mustn't hear. "It's up above us," said Coot in a whisper. "I know." The voice seemed to come from his bowels, not his throat, but it was bubbled through filth. "Let's have him come down here, shall we? He wants you, you know. He wants me to... What's happened to you?" Declan's face was just visible in the dark. It grinned, lunatic. "I think he might want to baptize you, too. How'd you like that?" "Like that, would you? He pissed on me. You see him? And that wasn't all. Oh, no, he wants more than that. He wants everything. Hear me? Everything." Declan grabbed hold of Coot, a bear hug that stank of the creature's urine. "Come with me?" He leered in Coot's face. "I put my trust in God." Declan laughed. Not a hollow laugh. There was genuine compassion in it for his lost soul. "He is God," he said. "He was here before this fucking shithouse was built. You know that. So were dogs. Doesn't mean I'd let them cock their legs on me." "Clever old fucker, aren't you?" said Declan, the smile inverted. "He'll show you. You'll change." "No, Declan, let go of me." The embrace was too strong. "Come up the stairs, fuckface. Mustn't keep God waiting." He pulled Coot up the stairs, arms still locked round him. Words, all logical argument, eluded Coot. Was there nothing he could say to make the man see his degradation? They made an ungainly entrance into the church, and Coot automatically looked towards the altar, hoping for some reassurance, but he got none. The altar had been desecrated. The cloths had been torn and smeared with excrement. The cross and candlesticks were in the middle of a fire of prayer books that burned healthily on the altar steps. Smuts floated around the church. The air was grimy with smoke. "You did this?" Declan grunted. "He wants me to destroy it all, take it apart, stone by stone if I have to." "He wouldn't dare." "Oh, he'd dare. He's not scared of Jesus. He's not scared of..." The certainty lapsed for a telling instant, and Coot slept on the hesitation. "There's something here he is scared of, though, isn't there? Or he'd have come in here himself, done it all himself." Declan wasn't looking at Coot. His eyes had glazed. "What is it, Declan? What is it he doesn't like? You can tell me." Declan spat on Coot's face, a wad of thick phlegm that hung on his cheeks like a slug. "None of your business." "In the name of Christ, Declan, look at what he's done to you." "I know my master when I see him." Declan was shaking. "And so will you." He turned Coot round to face the south door. It was open, and the creature was there on the threshold, stooping gracefully to duck under the porch. For the first time, Coot saw Rawhead in a good light, and the terrors began in earnest. He had avoided thinking too much of its size, its stare, its origins. Now, as it came towards him with slow, even stately steps, his heart conceded its mastery. It was no mere beast, despite its mane and its awesome array of teeth. Its eyes lanced him through and through, gleaming with the depth of contempt no animal could even muster. Its mouth opened wider and wider, the teeth gliding. Its mouth opened wider and wider, the teeth gliding from the gums, 2-3 inches long, and still the mouth was gaping wider. When there was nowhere to run, Declan let Coot go. Not that Coot could have moved anyway. The stare was too insistent. Rawhead reached out and picked Coot up. The world turns on its head. There were 7 officers, not 6, as Coot had guessed. 3 of them were armed, their weapons brought down from London on the order of Detective Sergeant Gissing. The late, soon-to-be decorated posthumously, Detective Sergeant Gissing. They were led, these 7 good men and true, by Sergeant Ivanhoe Baker. Ivanhoe was not a heroic man, either by inclination or education. His voice, which he had prayed would give the appropriate orders when the time came, without betraying him, came out as a strangled yelp as Rawhead appeared from the interior of the church. "I could see it," he said. Everybody could. It was 9 feet tall, covered in blood, and looked like hell on legs. Nobody needed to point it out. The guns were raised without Ivanhoe's instruction, and the unarmed men, suddenly feeling naked, kissed their truncheons and prayed. One of them ran. "Hold your ground!" Ivanhoe shrieked. If those sons of bitches turned tail, he'd be left on his own. They hadn't issued him with a gun, just authority, and that was not much comfort. Rawhead was still holding Coot up at arm's length by the neck. The Reverend's legs dangled a foot above the ground, his head lolled back, his eyes closed. The monster displayed the body for his enemies, proof of power. Shall we... Please, can't we shoot the bastard? One of the gunmen inquired. Ivanhoe swallowed before answering. We'll hit the vicar. He's dead already, said the gunman. We don't know that. He must be dead. Look at him. Rawhead was shaking Coot like an eiderdown, and his stuffing was falling out, much to Ivanhoe's intense disgust. Then, almost lazily, Rawhead flung Coot at the police. The body hit the gravel a little way from the gate and lay still. Ivanhoe found his voice. Shoot! The gunmen needed no encouragement. Their fingers were depressing the triggers before the symbol was out of his mouth. Rawhead was hit by 3 or 4 or 5 bullets in quick succession, most of them on the chest. They stung him, and he put up an arm to protect his face, covering his balls with the other hand. This was a pain he hadn't anticipated. The wound he'd received from Nicholson's rifle had been forgotten in the bliss of the bloodletting that came soon after, but these barbs hurt him, and they kept coming. He felt a twinge of fear. His instinct was to fly in the face of these popping, flashing rods, but the pain was too much. Instead, he turned and made his retreat, leaping over the tombs as he fled toward the safety of the hills. There were copses he knew, burrows and caves where he could hide and find time to think this new problem through, but first he had to elude them. They were after him quickly, flushed with the ease of their victory, leaving Ivanhoe to find a base of one of the graves, empty it with chrysanthemums, and be sick. Out of the dip, there were no lights along the road, and Rawhead began to feel safer. He could melt into the darkness, into the earth. He'd done it 1,000 times. He cut across the field. The barley was still unharvested and heavy with its grain. He trampled it as he ran, grinding seed and stalk. At his back, his pursuers were already losing the chase. The car they'd piled into had stopped in the road. He could see its lights, 1 blue, 2 white, way behind him. The enemy was shouting a confusion of orders, words Rawhead didn't understand. No matter, he knew men. They were easily frightened. They would not look far for him tonight. They'd use the dark as an excuse to call off the search, telling themselves that his wounds were probably fatal anyhow, trusting children that they were. He climbed to the top of the hill and looked down into the valley. Below the snake of the road, its eyes the headlights of the enemy's cars. The village has a wheel of warm light with flashing blues and reds at its hubs. Beyond in every direction, the impenetrable black of the hills over which the stars hung in loops and clusters. By day, this would seem a counterpane valley, toy town small. By night, it was fathomless, more his than theirs. His enemies were already returning to their hovels, as he'd known they would. The chase was over for the night. He lay down on the earth and watched a meteor burn as it fell to the southwest. It was a brief, bright streak which edge-lit a cloud, then went out. Morning was many long, healing hours in the future. He would soon be strong again, and then, he'd burn them all away. Coot was not dead, but so close to death it scarcely made any difference. 80% of the bones in his body were fractured or broken. His face and neck were a maze of lacerations. One of his hands was crushed almost beyond recognition. He would certainly die. It was purely a matter of time and inclination. In the village, those who had glimpsed so much as a fragment of the stories in the dip were already elaborating on their stories, and the evidence of the naked eye lent credence to the most fantastic inventions. The chaos in the churchyard, the smashed door in the vestry, the cordoned-off car in the North Road, whatever had happened that Saturday night, it was going to take a long time to forget. There was no harvest festival service, which came as no surprise to anyone. Maggie was insistent. I want us to all go back to London. A day ago, you wanted us to stay here, get to be a part of the community. That was on Friday, before all this... There's a maniac loose, Ron. If we go now, we won't come back. What are you talking about? Of course we will. If we leave once the place is threatened, we give up on it altogether. That's ridiculous. You're the one who was so keen on us being visible, being seen and join in the village life. Well, we'll have to join in the deaths too. And I'm going to stay, see it through. You can go back to London, take the kids. No, he sighed heavily. I want to see him caught, whoever he is. I want to know it's all been cleared up, see it with my own eyes. That's the only way we'll ever feel safe here. Reluctantly, she nodded. At least let's get out of the hotel for a while. Mrs. Blatter's gone loopy. Can't we go for a drive, get some air? Yes, why not? It was a balmy September day. The countryside, always willing to spring a surprise, was gleaming with life. Late flowers shone in the roadside hedges. Birds dipped over the road as they drove. The sky was azure, the clouds of fantasia and cream. A few miles outside the village, all the horrors of the previous night began to evaporate, and the sheer exuberance of the day began to raise the family's spirits. With every mile they drove out of Zeal, Ron's fears diminished. Soon he was singing. On the back seat, Debbie was being difficult. One moment, I'm hot, Daddy. The next, I want an orange juice, Daddy. The next, I have to pee. Ron stopped the car on an empty stretch of road and played the indulgent father. The kids have been through a lot today. They could be spoiled. All right, darling, you have pee here, then we'll go and find ice cream for you. Where's the la-la, she said. Damn stupid phrase, mother-in-law's euphemism. Maggie chipped in. She was better with Debbie in these moods than Ron. You can go behind the hedge, she said. Debbie looked horrified. Ron exchanged a half-smile with Ian. The boy had a put-upon look on his face. Grimacing, he went back to his dog-eared comic. Hurry up, can't you? He muttered. Then we can go somewhere proper. Somewhere proper, thought Ron. He means a town. He's a city kid. It's going to take a while to convince him that a hill with a view is somewhere proper. Debbie was still being difficult. I can't go here, Mummy. Why not? Somebody might see me. Nobody's going to see you, darling, Ron reassured her. Now do as your mummy says. He turned to Maggie. Go with her, love. Maggie wasn't budging. She's okay. She can't climb over the gate on her own. Well, you go then. Ron was determined not to argue. He forced a smile. Come on, he said. Debbie got out of the car and Ron helped her over the iron gate into the field beyond. It was already harvested. It smelt earthy. Don't look, she admonished him wide-eyed. You mustn't look. She was already a manipulator at the ripe old age of 9. She could play him better than the piano she was taking lessons on. He knew it, and so did she. He smiled at her and closed his eyes. All right, see, I've got my eyes closed. Now hurry up, Debbie, please. Promise you won't peek. I won't peek. My God, he thought, she's certainly making a production number out of this. Hurry up. He glanced back towards the car. Ian was sitting in the back, still reading, engrossed in some cheap heroics, his face set as he stared into the adventure. The boy was so serious. The occasional half-smile was all Ron could ever win from him. It wasn't a put-on. It wasn't a fake air of mystery. He seemed content to leave all the performing to his sister. Behind the hedge, Debbie pulled down her Sunday knickers and squatted, but after all the fuss, her pee wouldn't come. She concentrated, but that just made it worse. Ron looked up at the field towards the horizon. There were gulls up there, squabbling over a tidbit. He watched them in a while, impatience growing. Come on, love, he said. He looked back at the car, and Ian was watching him now, his face slack with boredom, or something like it. Was there something else here, a deep resignation, Ron thought? The boy looked back at his comic book, Utopia, without acknowledging his father's gaze. Then Debbie screamed, an ear-piercing shriek. Christ! Ron was clambering over the gate in an instant, and Maggie wasn't far behind him. Debbie! Ron found her standing against the hedge, staring at the ground, blubbering, face red. What's wrong, for God's sake? She was yabbering incoherently. Ron followed her eye. What happened? Maggie was having difficulty getting over the gate. It's all right, it's all right. There was a dead mole almost buried in the tangle at the edge of the field, its eyes pecked out, its rotting hide crawling with flies. Oh, God, Ron. Maggie looked at him accusingly, as though he'd put the damn thing there with malice aforethought. It's all right, sweetheart, she said, elbowing past her husband and wrapping Debbie up in her arms. Her sobs quieted a bit. City kids, thought Ron. They're going to have to get used to that sort of thing if they're going to live in the country. No road sweepers here to brush up the run-over cats every morning. Maggie was rocking her, and the worst of the tears were apparently over. She'll be all right, Ron said. Of course she will. Won't you, darling? Maggie helped her pull up her knickers. She was still sniveling, her need for privacy forgotten in her unhappiness. In the back of the car, Ian listened to his sister's caterwauling and tried to concentrate on his comic. Anything for attention, he thought. Well, she's welcome. Suddenly it went dark. He looked up from the page, his heart loud. At his shoulder, 6 inches away from him, something stooped to peer in the car, its face like hell. He couldn't scream, his tongue refused to move. All he could do was flood the seat and kick uselessly as the long, scarred arms reached through the window towards him. The nails of the beast gouged his ankles, tore his sock. One of his new shoes fell off in the struggle. Now it had his foot, and he was being dragged across the wet seat towards the window. He found his voice. Not quite his voice. It was a pathetic, silly-sounding voice, not the equal of the mortal terror he felt. And it was all too late anyway. It was dragging his legs through the window, and his bottom was almost through now. He looked through the back window as it hauled his torso into the open air, and in a dream he saw Daddy at the gate, his face looking so ridiculous. He was climbing the gate, coming to help, coming to save him, but he was far too slow. Ian knew he was beyond salvation from the beginning because he'd died this way in his sleep on 100 occasions, and Daddy never got there in time. The mouth was wider even than he'd dreamed it, a hole which he was being delivered into head first. It smelled like the dustbin at the back of a school canteen times a million. He was sick down his throat, and as it bit the top of his head off. Ron had never screamed in his life. The scream had always belonged to the other sex, until that instant. Then watching the monster stand up and close its jaws around his son's head, there was no sound appropriate but a scream. Rawhead heard the cry and turned, without a trace of fear on his face, to look at the source. Their eyes met. The king's glance penetrated Milton to a like a spike, freezing him to the road and to the marrow. It was Maggie who broke its hold, her voice a dirge. "Oh, please, no." Ron shook Rawhead's look from his head and started towards the car, towards his son. But the hesitation had given Rawhead a moment's grace he scarcely needed anyway, and he was already away, his catch clamped between his jaws, spilling out to right and left. The breeze carried motes of Ian's blood back down the road towards Ron. He felt him spot his face in a gentle shower. Declan stood in the chancel of St. Peter's and listened for the hum. It was still there. Sooner or later he'd have to go to the source of that sound and destroy it, even if it meant, as it might well, his own death. His new master would demand it. But that was par for the course, and the thought of death didn't distress him. Far from it. In the last few days he'd realized ambitions that he'd nurtured, unspoken, even unthought, for years. Looking up at the black bulk of the monster as it rained piss on him, he'd found the purest joy. If that experience, which would have once disgusted him, could be so consummate, what might death be like? Rarer still. And if he could contrive to die by Rawhead's hand, by that wide hand that smelt so rank, wouldn't that be the rarest of the rare? He looked up at the altar and at the remains of the fire the police had extinguished. They'd searched for him after Coot's death, but he'd had a dozen hiding places they would never find, and they'd soon given up. Bigger fish to fry. He collected a fresh armful of songs of praise and threw them down amongst the damp ashes. The candlesticks were warped, but still recognizable. The cross had disappeared, either shriveled away or removed by some light-fingered officer of the law. He tore a few handfuls of hymns from the books and lit a match. The old songs caught easily. Ron Milton was tasting tears, and it was a taste he'd forgotten. It was many years since he'd wept, especially in front of other males. But he didn't care any longer. These bastard policemen weren't human anyway. They just looked at him while he poured out his story and nodded like idiots. "We've drafted men in front of every division within 50 miles, Mr. Milton," said the bland face with the understanding eyes. "The hills are being scoured. We'll have it, whatever it is. It took my child, you understand me? It killed him in front of me." They didn't seem to appreciate the horror of it all. "We're doing what we can. It's not enough. This thing, it's not human." Ivanhoe, with the understanding eyes, knew bloody well how unhuman it was. There's people coming from the Ministry of Defense. We can't do much more till they've had a look at the evidence," he said, then added as a sop, "It's all public money, sir." "You fucking idiot! What does it matter what it costs to kill it? It's not human. It's out of hell." Ivanhoe's look lost compassion. "If it came out of hell, sir," he said, "I don't think it would have found the Reverend Coot such easy pickings." Coot. That was his man. Why hadn't he thought of that before? Coot. Ron had never been much of a man of God, but he was prepared to be open-minded now that he'd seen the opposition, or one of its troops. He was ready to reform his opinion. He'd believe anything at all, if it gave him a weapon against the devil. He must get to Coot. "What about your wife?" the officer called after him. Maggie was sitting in one of the side offices, dumb with sedation, Debbie asleep beside her. There was nothing he could do for them. They were safe here as anywhere. He must get to Coot before he died. He'd know whatever reverends know, and he'd understand the pain better than these monkeys. Dead sons were the crux of the church, after all. As he got into the car, it seemed for a moment he smelt his son, the boy who would have carried his name, Ian Ronald Milton, he'd been christened, the boy who was his sperm made flesh, who he had circumcised like himself, the quiet child who'd looked out of the car at him with such resignation in his eyes. This time, the tears didn't begin. This time, there was an anger that was almost wonderful. It was 11:30 at night. Rawhead Rex lay under the moon in one of the harvested fields of the southwest of the Nicholson farm. The stubble was darkening now, and there was a tantalizing smell of rotting vegetable matter off the earth. Beside him lay his dinner, Ian Ronald Milton, face up on the field, his midstriff torn open. Occasionally the beast would lean up on one elbow and paddle its fingers in the cooling soup of the boy-child's body, fishing for a delicacy. Here under the full moon, bathing in silver, stretching its limbs and eating the flesh of humankind, he felt irresistible. His fingers drew a kidney off the plate beside him, and he swallowed it whole. Sweet. Coot was awake despite the sedation. He knew he was dying, and the time was too precious to doze through. He didn't know the name of the face that was interrogating him in the yellow gloom of his room, but the voice was so politely insistent he had to listen, even though it interrupted his peacemaking with God. Besides, they had questions in common, and they all circled those questions on the beast that had reduced him to this pulp.
"It took my son," the man said. "What do you know about the thing? Please tell me. I'll believe whatever you tell me." Now there was desperation. "Just explain." Time and again, as he'd lain on the hot pillow, confused thoughts had raced through Coot's mind. Declan's baptism, the embrace of the beast, the altar, his hair rising and his flesh too. Maybe there was something he could tell the father at his bedside. In the church. Ron leaned closer to Coot. He smelt of earth already. "The altar. It's afraid. The altar." "You mean the cross? It's afraid of the cross?" "No. Not. The body creaked once and stopped. Ron watched death come over the face, the saliva dry on Coot's lips, the iris of his remaining eye contract. He watched a long while before he rang for the nurse, then quietly made his escape. There was somebody in the church. The door, which had been padlocked by the police, was ajar, the lock smashed. Ron pushed it open a few inches and slid inside. There was no lights on in the church. The only illumination was a bonfire on the altar steps. It was being tended by a young man Ron had seen on and off in the village. He looked up from his fire watching, but kept feeding the flames the guts of books. "What can I do for you?" he asked without interest. "I came to—" Ron hesitated. "What, to tell this man the truth?" "No, there was something wrong here." "I asked you a friggin' question," said the man. "What do you want?" As he walked down the aisle towards the fire, Ron began to see the questioner in more detail. There were stains like mud on his clothes, and his eyes had sunk in their orbits as if his brain had sucked them in. "You got no right to be here." "I thought anyone could come into a church," said Ron, staring at the burning pages as they blackened. "Not tonight. You get the fuck out of here." Ron kept walking towards the altar. "You get the fuck out, I said." The face in front of Ron was alive with leers and grimaces. There was lunacy in it. "I came to see the altar. I'll go when I've seen it, and not before." "You been talking to Coot? That it?" "Coot? What'd the old wanker tell you? It's all a lie, whatever it was. He never told the truth in his friggin' life. You know that? You take it from me. He used to get up there," he threw a prayer book at the pulpit, "and tell fucking lies." "I want to see the altar for myself. We'll see if he was telling lies." "No, you won't." The man threw another handful of books onto the fire and stepped down to block Ron's path. He smelt not of mud, but of shit. Without warning, he pounced. His hands seized Ron's neck, and the two of them toppled over. Declan's fingers reaching to gouge at Ron's eyes, his teeth snapping at his nose. Ron was surprised at the weakness of his own arms, why he hadn't played much squash the way Maggie had suggested. Why were his muscles so ineffectual? If he wasn't careful, this man was going to kill him. Suddenly, a light, so bright it could have been a midnight dawn, splashed through the west window. A cloud of screams followed close by. Firelight, dwarfing the bonfire to the altar steps, dyed the air. The stained glass danced. Declan forgot his victim for an instant, and Ron rallied. He pushed the man's chin back and got a knee under his torso, then kicked hard. The enemy went reeling, and Ron was up after him, a fistful of hair securing the target while the ball of his other hand hammered at Lunatic's face till it broke. It wasn't enough to see the bastard's nose bleed or to hear the cartilage mashed. Ron kept beating and beating until his fist bled. Only then did he let Declan drop. Outside, Zeal was ablaze. Rawhead had made fires before, many fires, but petrol was a new weapon, and he was still getting the hang of it. It didn't take long for him to learn. The trick was to wound the wheeled boxes. That was easy. Open their flanks, and out their blood would pour, blood that made his head ache. The boxes were easy prey, lined up on the pavement like bullocks to be slaughtered. He went amongst them, demented with death, splashing their blood down the high street and igniting it. Streams of liquid fire poured into gardens, over thresholds, thatches caught, wood-beaten cottages went up. In minutes, Zeal was burning from end to end. In St. Peter's, Ron dragged a filthy cloth off the altar, trying to block out all thoughts of Debbie and Margaret. The police would move them to a place of safety for certain. The issue at hand must take precedence. Beneath the cloth was a large box, its front panel roughly carved. He took no notice of the design. There were more urgent matters to attend to. Outside, the beast was loose. He could hear triumphant roars, and he felt eager, yes, eager to go to it, to kill or be killed. But first the box. It contained power, no doubt about that. A power that was even now raising the hairs on his head, that was working at his cock, giving him an aching heart-on. His flesh seemed to seethe with it. It elated him like love. Hungry, he put his hands on the box, and a shock that seemed to cook his joints ran up both his arms. He fell back, and for a moment he wondered if he was going to remain conscious. The pain was so bad, but it subsided in moments. He cast around for a tool, something to get him into the box without laying fresh to it. In desperation, he wrapped his hand with a piece of the altar cloth and snatched one of the brass candle holders from the edge of the fire. The cloth began to smolder as the heat worked its way through his hand. He stepped back to the altar and beat at the wood like a madman until it began to splinter. His hands were numb now. If the heated candlesticks were burning his palms, he wouldn't feel it. What did it matter, anyhow? There was a weapon here, a few inches away from him. If only he could get to it, to wield it. His erection throbbed, his balls tingled. "Come to me," he found himself saying. "Come on, come on, come on, come to me." Like he was willing it to his embrace, this treasure, like it was a girl he wanted, his heart unwanted, and he was hypnotizing her into his bed. "Come to me, come to me." The wood facade was breaking. Panting now, he used the corners of the candlestick base to lever larger chunks of timber away. The altar was hollow, and he'd known it would be, and empty. Empty. Except for a ball of stone the size of a small football. Was that his prize? He couldn't believe how insignificant it looked, and yet the air was still electric around him. His blood still danced. He reached through the hole he'd made in the altar and picked the relic up. Outside, Rawhead was jubilating. Images flashed before Ron's eyes as he weighed the stone in his deadened hand. A corpse with its feet burning, a flaming cot, a dog running along the street, a living ball of fire. It was all outside, waiting to unfold. Against the perpetrator, he had this stone. He trusted God just for half a day, and he got shat on. It was just stone. Just fucking stone. He turned the football over and over in his hand, trying to make some sense of its furrows and its mounds. Was it meant to be something? Perhaps he was missing its deeper significance? There was a knot of noise at the other end of the church, a crash, a cry from beyond the door, a whoosh of flame. 2 people staggered in, followed by smoke and pleas. "He's burning the village," said a voice Ron knew. It was that benign policeman who hadn't believed in hell. He was trying to keep his act together, perhaps for the benefit of his own companion, Mrs. Blatter from the hotel. The nightdress she'd run into the street wearing was torn. Her breasts were exposed. They shook with her sobs. She didn't seem to know she was naked. Didn't even know where she was. "Christ in heaven help us," said Ivanhoe. "There's no fucking Christ in here," came Declan's voice. He was standing up and reeling towards the intruders. Ron couldn't see his face from where he stood, but he knew it must be damn it unrecognizable. Mrs. Blatter avoided him as he staggered towards the door, and she ran towards the altar. She'd been married here on the very spot he'd built the fire. Ron stared at her body entranced. She was considerably overweight, her breasts sagging, her belly overshadowing her cunt, so he doubted if she could even see it. But it was for this his cockhead throbbed, for this his head reeled. Her image was in his hand. God, yes, she was there in his hand. She was the living equivalent of what he held, a woman. The stone was the statue of a woman, a Venus grosser than Miss Blatter, her belly swelling with children, tits like mountains, cunt a valley that began at her navel and gaped to the world. All this time, under the cloth and the cross, they'd bowed their heads to a goddess. Ron stepped off the altar and began to run down the aisle, pushing Mrs. Blatter, the policeman, and the lunatic aside. "Don't go out," said Ivanhoe. "It's right outside." Ron held the Venus tight, feeling her weight in his hands and taking security from her. Behind him, the verger was screeching a warning to his lord. Yes, it was a warning for sure. Ron kicked open the door. On every side, fire, a flaming cot, a corpse. It was the postmaster, with his feet burning, a dog skinned by fire, hurtling past, and Rawhead, of course, silhouetted against a panorama of flames. It looked round, perhaps because it heard the warnings the verger was yelling, but more likely, he thought, because it knew without being told, that the woman had been found. "Here!" Ron yelled. "I'm here! I'm here!" It was coming for him now, with the steady gait of a victor closing in to claim its final and absolute victory. Doubt surged up to Ron. Why did it come so surely to meet him, not seeming to care about the weapon he carried in his hands? Hadn't it heard the warning? Unless... Oh, God in heaven. Unless Coot had been wrong. Unless it was only a stone he held in his hand, a useless, meaningless lump of stone. Then a pair of hands grabbed him around the neck, the lunatic. A low voice spat the word "fucker" in his ear. Ron watched Rawhead approaching, heard the lunatic screeching. "Here he is! Fetch him! Kill him! Here he is!" Without warning, the grip slackened, and Ron half turned to see Ivanhoe dragging the lunatic back against the church wall. The mouth on the verger's broken face continued to screech. "He's here! He's here!" Ron looked back at Rawhead. The beast was almost on him, and he was too slow to raise the stone in self-defense. But Rawhead had no intention of taking him. It was Declan he was smelling and hearing. Ivanhoe released Declan as Rawhead's huge hands veered past Ron and fumbled for the lunatic. What followed was unwatchable. Ron couldn't bear to see the hands take Declan apart, but he heard the gabble of pleas become whoops of disbelieving grief. When he next looked round, there was nothing recognizably human on ground or wall. And Rawhead was coming for him now, coming to do the same or worse. The huge head craned round to fix on Ron, its maw gaping, and Ron saw how the fire had wounded Rawhead.
The beast had been careless in the enthusiasm for destruction. Fire had caught its face and upper torso. Its body hair was crisped, its mane was stubble, and the flesh on the left-hand side of the face was black and blistered. The flames had roasted its eyeballs. They were swimming in a gum of mucus and tears. That's why it had followed Declan's voice and bypassed Ron. It could scarcely see. But it must see now. It must. Here, said Ron. Here I am. Rawhead heard. He looked without seeing, his eyes trying to focus. Here, I'm here. Rawhead growled in his chest. His burned face pained him. He wanted to be away from here, away in the cool of a birch thicket, moon-washed. His dimmed eyes found the stone. The Homo sapien was nursing it like a baby. It was difficult for Rawhead to see clearly, but he knew. It ached in his mind, that image. It pricked him just to tease him. It was just a symbol, of course, a sign of the power, not the power itself, but his mind made no such distinction. To him, the stone was the thing he feared most, the bleeding woman, her gaping hole eating seed and spitting children. It was life, that hole, that woman. It was endless fecundity. It terrified him. Rawhead stepped back on his own shit, running freely down his leg. The fear on his face gave Ron strength. That he pressed home his advantage, closing in after the retreating beast, dimly aware that Ivanhoe was rallying allied around him, armed figures, waiting at the corners of his vision, eager to bring the fire riser down. His own strength was failing him. The stone, lifted high above his head so Rawhead could see it plainly, seemed heavier by the moment. Go on, he said quietly to the gathering zealots. Go on, take him, take him. They began to close in even before he finished speaking. Rawhead smelt them more than saw them. His hurting eyes were fixed on the woman. His teeth slid from their sheaths in preparation for the attack. The stench of humanity closed in around him from every direction. Panic overcame his superstitions for one moment, and he snatched down towards Ron, steeling himself against the stone. The attack took Ron by surprise. The claws sank in his scalp. Blood poured down his face. Then the crowd closed in. Human hands, weak, white human hands, were laid on Rawhead's body. Fists beat on his spine, nails raked his skin. He let Ron go as somebody took a knife in the back of his legs and hamstrung him. The agony made him howl, the sky down, or so it seemed. In Rawhead's roasted eyes, the stars reeled as he fell backwards in the road, his back cracking under him. They took the advantage immediately, overpowering him by sheer weight of numbers. He snapped off a finger here, a face there, but they would not be stopped now. Their hatred was old in their bones. Did they but know it? He thrashed under their assault for as long as he could, but knew death was certain. There would be no resurrection this time, no waiting in the earth for an age until their descendants forgot him. He'd be snuffed out absolutely, and there would be nothingness. He became quieter at the thought and looked up as best he could to where the little father was standing. Their eyes met as they had on the road when he'd taken the boy. But now Rawhead's look had lost its power to transfix. His face was empty and sterile as the moon, defeated long before Ron slammed the stone down between his eyes. The skull was soft, it buckled inwards, and a slop of brains splattered the road. The king went out. It was suddenly over, without ceremony or celebration. Out, once and for all. There was no cry. Ron left the stone where it lay, half buried in the face of the beast. He stood up groggily and felt his head. His scalp was loose, his fingertips touched the skull. Blood came and came, but there were arms to support him and nothing to fear if he slept. It went unnoticed, but in death, Rawhead's bladder was emptying. A stream of urine pulsed from the corpse and ran down the road. The rivulet steamed into the chilling air, its scummy nose sniffing left and right as it looked for a place to drain. After a few feet, it found the gutter and ran along to a crack in the tarmac. There it drained off into the welcoming earth. And that is Rawhead Rex. Next week is Confessions of a Pornographer's Shroud. I think I dropped my glasses. Thank you for reading with me, and we will see